What's the worst Spider-Man game you've ever played? Chances are, you said The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, what's the worst Spider-Man movie you've ever seen? Uh-oh. That's a pattern. Nearly everything tied to The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was a disaster. And while the discussion of the movie's good and bad aspects have been talked about online at length, the video game never got the same attention, at least, not the attention it was looking for.
It's received this reputation as being the worst Spider-Man game ever made, and after playing it, I can definitely see why.
Passionately mediocre is the term I use.
It is average at best.
The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is yet another example of what happens when games are rushed out to coincide with the movie release date.
Yeah, this game was panned heavily on release, and I want to find out why. I have a soft spot for this game because for years, this was the only Spider-Man game I could play on my PS4, as I sold my PS3 and my other Spider-Man games to get said PS4, which does mean I sort of had to like it at the time. But now I have access to a ton of Spider-Man games, so I can look at the game with a critical lens. So I want to answer, was The Amazing Spider-Man 2 good? If so or not, then why? Or perhaps, should you buy it? Well, I can answer that one for free. No. Because you can't buy it. Activision did not renew the license for their Spider-Man games, meaning any old Spider-Man game needs to be bought physically, or you gotta sail the high seas. Now, we would never condone piracy here on the That Boy Aqua channel, but I can say that purchasing these games through classified vendors is extremely easy, except for The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And I think this says a lot about the game's reputation. Many of these vendors have mission objectives along the lines of wanting to preserve abandoned games so they aren't lost to time, and yet, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a tough find. So basically, these websites are saying, we want to preserve video games, but not this one, because this one sucks. Well, does The Amazing Spider-Man 2 suck? I mean, sort of, but it's more complicated than that.
You know what's not complicated?
What?
Me. I'm back, and I trace your IP address, meaning I know exactly where you live.
Oh yeah? Go for it.
Venezuela.
No.
What? How?
Because I'm using the sponsor of today's video, private internet access. Browsing the internet without a VPN is like peeing with the door open. You're completely exposed, man. Furthermore, sometimes there's content I want to watch like on Netflix, but it's only available in certain countries. PIA helps me bypass those restrictions and prevents me from being victim to any number of hacks and exploits.
Well, I bet it can't be that secure. They probably sell your data like any other ISP.
They actually don't, and in fact, they've proven their no logs policy multiple times in court, making this the world's most transparent VPN provider.
So what, your PC's safe, but what about your other devices, huh?
IPA covers all of your devices, and all for one price, which is cheap for people who use my link in the description or pinned comment, because they'll be able to get 83% off and 4 months free on a 2-year subscription, meaning it's $2 a month.
Well, is that extra privacy worth slowing your connection?
It doesn't. PIA has basically no impact on ping in games, meaning I can stay secure and still clutch up without worry.
Wow. I mean, it seems like they really got it all figured out.
Yeah, and hey, if you want to try it, then again, feel free to head to this link in the description and the pinned comment to pick up 2 years of private internet access at 83% off and with an extra 4 months for free. For just $2 a month, you can take back your privacy, and there's even a 30-day money-back guarantee if you decide you don't like it. What do you say?
I say that this is only a roadblock, and you won't stop me from coming back in when I do.
Yeah, I'm sure. Anyways, where was I? Before we get ahead of ourselves, I have to mention that while you may see stuttering or performance issues here, I don't want to hold it against the game, because there's a good chance I'm not playing the most up-to-date version, as when purchasing the game through aforementioned vendors, you can't always get an update. I can in good faith assume that performance issues, of which there were plenty, are likely fixed, but no amount of patches, plastic surgery, or even paper bags are going to fix the monstrosities on display. This is what most astounds me about The Amazing Spider-Man 2. It looks worse than the first game. How the fuck does that happen? Keep in mind, The Amazing Spider-Man 1 released on the previous console generation, and while it too had some questionable art decisions, the massive phone for a minimap that takes up what feels like half the screen was a head scratcher, but genuinely, everything here looks worse. I'd love to say that this is for a good reason, but I don't believe it is, and if a lack of mechanical depth was a killing blow for The Amazing Spider-Man 1, then The Amazing Spider-Man 2 being worse in nearly every way from its predecessor is enough to make TASM 2's fatal flaw a beach ball-sized hole in its chest. Let's start with the titular character himself, whose suit doesn't look half bad, but when compared to the TASM 1 suit, yeah, I don't know what to say. What's interesting too is that I like the second game suit so much more. It's one of the best designs for a classic Spidey look, and yet the TASM 1 suit fits in this world so much more, and generally does look better. But as far as texture work is concerned, the TASM 1 suit clears here, and most of the suits in the game are very hit or miss. Some of them, like the Cosmic suit, the Black suit, or the Vigilante suit, look great, and personally, the Vigilante suit is one of my favorite homemade suits, and maybe that's a hot take. But then other suits like the Miles Morales suit have no depth to them. them, and it sucks to see, again, compared to the first game. The biggest strength of the first game, the one that carried it in my eyes, was the spectacle and the animations. I firmly believe that The Amazing Spider-Man 1 has some of the best animation work the character's ever seen in a game. Every punch has impact, and Spider-Man, like the acrobat he is, would flip around the enemies in a way that no other Spider-Man game has provided. Mechanically, it wasn't up to par, and we'll talk about that, but for now, we need to understand that as superficial as it may be, looks are important. A Spider-Man game that wants to make you feel like Spider-Man, at the bare minimum, needs to make you look like Spider-Man, and The Amazing Spider-Man 1 looks closer to Spider-Man than any of the other games I've played. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 attempts to carry this trend, and at most times, it succeeds. I wanted to see more flips and dives during combat, but what's on display here, a mix of new and old animations, is eye candy that I could feast on endlessly. The same goes for the swinging, which looks better in some ways and worse in others. For one, rejoice my brothers and sisters, because the webs stick to buildings, and anyone who had motion sickness from the first game will be happy to hear that the camera's pulled back, which I am conflicted about. The camera, as much as many people hated it, did achieve something the hardware couldn't. Many of the newer Spider-Man games want to achieve more stable swinging, and in order to not have speed cause issues with texture pop-in and part of the city not loading, developers will limit your speed. But there's a problem, where swinging doesn't feel like it has weight. For example, look at Spider-Man here, swinging out of a dive. He should be launched across New York, and his speed is the same as if he just started. I'm not trying to criticize this decision per se, but I'm trying to illustrate the problem so I can emphasize how the camera acted as a solution. The camera being so close to Spider-Man in the first game allowed the game to emulate speed without actually achieving it. Furthermore, it gave the game a sense of identity. No other game has a camera so close, so when I see a frame of this game, I can immediately tell what it is. Now sure, this applies to The Amazing Spider-Man 2 as well, but not for a good reason. So many of the cutscenes here are just limp. Don't get me wrong, some of them are good, but once again, the first game did it better. The voice acting is serviceable, just like the first game, but I found some characters to be extremely annoying. Like when Herman Schultz continuously says, huh, in every sentence.
Better, huh? Huh? Sure. What do you want to know?
Maybe it's a New Yorker thing, I don't know, I'm just walking here. Let's move forward. But before we do, peep the loading screens. I know this is a nitpick, but the loading screens are just abysmal. Look at the fucking Carnage screen. Look at his face. What happened? Electro's loading screen looks ridiculous too, but I promise this video won't be all negative, okay? I think this game has some redeeming qualities. To go back to the swinging, the web rush continues to be fun and fluid in both its animations and utility. The city looks fine, again worse than the first game, but at least you'll be moving fast enough to not notice. And at night, the low exposure covers many of the blemishes, making it look honestly good in motion. When everything clicks, I found myself having fun with the movement, and changes have been made to allow accidents or slip-ups to look natural, such as when slamming into a wall. But as far as presentation goes, that's about where the compliments end. Unfortunately, any compliment to the game's looks or animations are undercut by the fact that the previous game on a previous generation did it better. But like I said, looks aren't everything, and maybe The Amazing Spider-Man traded the style of its predecessor for more mechanical depth. Spoiler, they didn't. Let's start with swinging, because it's where I can be the most charitable. The swinging now has both hands mapped to the triggers, meaning if you pull the left trigger, you'll swing with the left hand, and the same goes for the right. This gives you some extra freedom in your movement, which is appreciated, and the animations out of your swings look solid too. You can hold both triggers to get a boost, and slingshotting is here, but outside of the novelty, it loses a lesser quickly. The web rush returns and feels better than before, as you can now continue movement past the point you rush to, meaning you can swing off a pole, run up a wall, and more out of a web rush. And the tech like canceling a rush halfway to maintain more speed, or using your current trajectory to control what route you take, returns, allowing the swinging to be on the whole much better. I think again, with the camera, there's a visceral velocity that's missing, but mechanically, I like this. You may not have as much control as previous games, but the cinematic effect is so strong that the trade-off is worth it, considering what this game is going for. I wish I had more to say, but the traversal is just so similar to the first game, and it was good in the first game, so nothing's lost in terms of freedom or expression. I wish that were the case for the stealth, because it would make it better than what we currently have, which is a more tedious, stripped-back iteration. The stealth in the first game wasn't great, but I at least appreciated some of the unique features, like the ability to retreat using a web to the nearest corner of a room, allowing for easy resets and more forgiving detection. It should be noted that the detection in the first game wasn't the best, but because the stealth was almost always optional, and because escape was so easy, it didn't make much of an impact on the overall experience. That is not the same here, and thus, the issues with stealth are ever more visible. Enemies have vision cones. With an upgrade, you can see those vision cones, but those cones are lying, because these guys will spot you if you look in their direction, and when they do, chances are you won't be able to react fast enough to get away, meaning stealth almost immediately devolves into combat. This is something many action games do. They design design the layout so that you have to use stealth as a means of thinning numbers. But the problem is that this tactic is already employed here, as seen in the many duos or trios that require a head-on approach, which leads me to believe the ridiculous detection time is not intentional. Furthermore, this is an issue in certain side missions where detection is a fail state. It makes stealth frustrating, and when it isn't that, it's boring. Every enemy except brutes can be taken down the same way as any other enemy. At times there are drones that can detect you, but it was never an issue. Every encounter is the same, and that's something I shouldn't be saying when it takes less than 5 hours to complete most of the meaningful content here. This is exacerbated by the animations. While the dives from the first game don't make a return, we do get some new animations, but they only play during the story missions and some side missions. Any takedowns done in the open world use the same animation over and over and over again. I have to imagine that this is a bug, because in a game like this where the visuals are the only thing keeping players engaged, there's no way they would limit this. With that said, stealth is boring, and that's worse than it being bad. We have genuinely regressed somehow, and unfortunately, the combat does take a step forward, but it's not a very big step. The combat in the first game was, get ready, repetitive, and that was because there wasn't much in the way of enemy variety. I mean, there was in visual variety, but they all went down the same way. If a new enemy didn't go down a particular way, you'd quickly get an upgrade that allowed you to take them down like normal, returning the game to its tedious state. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 took notes. It has improved the enemy variety. Now there are brutes that need to be stunned first, there are armored enemies that need to be webbed, and there are even fast enemies that must be pulled before damage can be dealt. Now it is true that these are all variations of roadblocks, you just press a button before attacking like normal, but I'd be lying if I said this wasn't an improvement over the first game, and this goes for balance too. The finishers that previously could be performed back to back now only happen every so often, meaning I had to actually engage with combat far more. There are still ways players are rewarded for timing, as holding the square button and punching just as the last attack connects will allow you to perform a heavier attack that will take enemies down slightly faster, and reward a higher combo. This kept me more engaged than the finishers, and the power these things have is addicting. Spidey's fists impacting with a kind of force unlike any of the comparatively limp acrobatics. The biggest issue with the combat is the lack of freedom. It's all just pressing square and occasionally triangle without much else in between. Moves from the first game don't return, and the ones that do, like throwing objects, are now locked behind an arbitrary upgrade. Most of the upgrades here don't change much either, with many of them being incremental increases to the power or efficiency of a move. In each category there is one upgrade that changes the way something works, like the seismic blast knocking down smaller enemies, but it's not enough to make me feel like I'm actually progressing. There are also suit levels that incrementally enhance the buffs associated with whatever suit you're wearing, of which there are plenty to choose. I know Insomniac has spoiled us, but for the time, this was a good selection, and some like the Cosmic Spider suit look excellent, and I'm shocked this is one of the few games to include these cooler suits alongside Hornet and Ricochet. Of course, classics are here too, like Spider-Man Noir and the Superior suit, and all things considered, I have no complaints with these outside of some of the texture work being dodgy, but you only really notice in the close-ups. I also appreciated that the suits tear like in the previous game, though not to the same degree, which is a bit disappointing. So I've illustrated here that the gameplay itself, outside of the swinging, is without much depth, and you know what? That was the case for the first game too, and I really liked the first game. The difference was that the Amazing Spider-Man had the set pieces to pick up the slack, but that is not the case here entirely. There are some high points. Electro's boss fight makes great use of his powers, even if the QuickTime event in the air makes him look so funny. Unfortunately though, most of these are just running into rooms filled with enemies and cleaning them up. We're lucky to not be in the sewers as much as the first game, but the trade-off isn't for anything much more interesting. We're still crawling through Oscorp vents, raiding warehouses, but at least the open world missions were a novelty. I won't go into the boss fights in the same detail I did with the first game because they are generally pretty good. They ramp up in complexity nicely, and they each have a unique gimmick to play around. I'd say mechanically it's a step up, but nothing's gonna top the massive robots from the first game. I'm not saying I don't want Spidey fighting classics from the Rogues Gallery, hell, I shit bricks when I first saw Carnage, but the arenas that surround these fights just lack the same balls to the wall scale that made the first game so memorable. Speaking of memories, that's where the game begins, as Peter relives the night that Uncle Ben died. It doesn't create the scene from the movie perfectly, in fact Peter comes off like even more of a dick, but it gets the job done, and it's not the only time we'll swap the spandex for the slice of life. As Peter, we'll often talk to characters and be thrusted into dialogue trees where we can learn more information, or so it may seem. There are always 4 options, with the rightmost being to end the conversation. More often than not, these other choices just lead to a more in-depth explanation of what otherwise would be covered in the cutscene. For example, when interrogating Herman Schultz about Ben's killer, we can ask all kinds of questions about the gang war, the tattoo, identifying the killer, but if we end the conversation, we answer all of those in a more concise manner. This isn't the case with all the dialogue. There are points like in the early game where you talk to May where Peter can unpack the guilt he feels for being grateful that Ben's killer was murdered by someone else. She can comfort him in those feelings throughout the dialogue options, and I appreciated that this conversation tried to make the distinction that while Peter is glad, he's more so happy that Kira can't hurt anyone else, and less happy that he got revenge in a roundabout way. This is a theme the game tries to bring up on more than a few occasions. This idea that Peter somewhat wants to permanently get rid of the criminals that terrorize the city, but he knows it's wrong. Certain characters like Kraven will push him to his limit, and even Cletus Cassidy will try to convince him, but the game doesn't doesn't go very far with it. I mean, fucking hell, the dialogue literally ends with Peter reminding himself that he's talking to a psychopath, and if that isn't a butchering of the character, I don't know what is.
Sorry, Cletus. I just figured out talking to a psycho killer isn't gonna give me the answers I'm after.
And I get it, Cletus is a nutcase, no doubt about it, but we could have done so much more here. Have Peter learn more of Cassidy's life, not through audio logs, and have him realize that there's a good chance Cletus's bloodlust is just a way of fighting back against a world that tortured him at every turn. A way for him to stop others from hurting others or being hurt themselves. This is fundamentally similar to Peter's motivations. He fights crime to stop the pain, the guilt he feels for letting his uncle die. The two have similar goals. One wants to heal the world and encourage a better world to thrive, but the other wants to cleanse the disease and fire. This is the way we can make Cletus a sympathetic villain without removing him from the role of an undeniable bad guy. And I don't mean an MCU kind of sympathetic villain where every time they low-key have a point. I mean the kind of sympathetic villain where they're still wrong, still evil, but you understand how they got there and why they won't come back. This isn't the only Carnage-related issue, as most of the game builds up to him, or at least a conspiracy surrounding him. There's an ongoing gang war that has all the gangs on edge, the catalyst for which is the Carnage killer. And look, side note, not to be that guy, but when the game spends 2 hours pretending like Peter doesn't know who the Carnage killer is, sucks ass. Anyone who's even slightly familiar with the character knows from the get-go. I mean, Carnage is in his name. I know I'm nitpicking, but man, it just feels like so many players were left with this limp dick dramatic irony. Anyways, there's still a mystery in how all the characters play into Cassidy's web. Herman Schultz becomes the shocker because all the gangs are trying to level up their firepower, scared that the Carnage killer will come for them next, and thinking that he's working for the other guys. Once Kraven is introduced, he begins mentoring Spider-Man under the guise of wanting to find the killer too, but it's eventually revealed that Kraven was using it as an excuse to learn how Peter thinks and moves, in an attempt to hunt him. During an encounter with Cletus, he mentions Kraven in an offhand manner. That implies Kraven may have been working with Cletus, but I think that's a stretch. I doubt Cletus would listen to anyone. Then we have Fisk, who after seeing Oscorp on the decline after all their failures with the cross species from the last game, decides to partner up with Harry to implement a task force that'll keep the streets safe. Issue is, they're as crooked as they come. And so is Kingpin. When we fight Kingpin, despite how humorous his segment is, he kicks off the ending portion of the game in which people just show up for borderline no reason. Electro, for example, just shows up. Max Dillon was in Oscorp and we saved him, but we don't see him at all from now until he's fully transformed. He has dialogue about how Spider-Man left him in the dark when, I don't know, he actually saved his life? It truly feels like the game is trying to be its own thing, but the movie it is associated with is forcing these other characters into it. I think that's why the Green Goblin just also shows up. He's built up a bit in a prior mission, but he has no impact otherwise. I don't know if this theory is even true because strangely, Gwen Stacy is nowhere to be seen in this game, which again, would have strengthened the plot. Having Peter be nearly pushed over the edge after Gwen's death, having the words of Cletus and Kraven echo in his mind to kill the person responsible so they can't harm anyone else ever again, would have been some solid drama, but she's gone, barely mentioned at all. All of this, the characters, the untied plot threads, the missed potential, makes me feel like this story is half-baked. I won't act like the first game was that great, but at least it tried to have moments of tension, moments of drama, suspense, but here it just feels incredibly by the numbers. At least there are moments of humor, like when Peter's trying to talk to Harry, but his gasping for air is so loud. Oh my god, man.
That's never the answer. It's the easy way out. You think it's hard for you? There are people sick, dying all over the world, some with the same disease, who don't have your money, resources. Even if you don't want to keep fighting for yourself, you owe it to them. You're gonna answer for your mistakes and do whatever you can to make up for them. The greatest man I ever knew talking about.
Now, you may be disappointed that the game is over, but don't you worry your sweet little head, because there are side quests that still require your attention, and guess what? They fucking stink! Look, I can admit that the Russian hideouts and combat challenges are entertaining, and hey, new suits are fun too. But otherwise, these are not bad. They're worse, because they're boring. Let's start with a series of photos across the map, which see you having to take a photo of something interesting like a murder scene, a police officer's laptop, or some shady individuals. Oh, you thought there was more? I'm not kidding when I say these same 3 scenes are on rotation around the map. These are collectibles for the sake of collectibles. Mind you, there's nothing wrong with collectibles. The comics return and are fun to nab, and you get to read a few comics along the way, but these have a defined map marker as if the game is beckoning you to see what's in store for you. Then we have the races, which are again, boring. Maybe it's because I played way too much of the Amazing Duology, and by now I say the word amazing with some heavy sarcasm, but these races were insanely easy, especially the ones where you can web rush directly to a ring, removing any challenge. For a large majority of these, you are pressing the bumper over and over, and there aren't even medals for these. It's a binary did you do it or did you not. If you want to truly engage with the swinging, you're better off doing so in the open world, but as far as content goes, things don't fare much better over there. Let's start with my biggest gripe. The first game lets you change the time of day after the main story, and this time you can't. Well, you can. You just have to hop on the train to go home, go through the loading screen, head back out to Manhattan, go through the loading screen, and then there's a chance the time of day will change, and what it changes to is whatever the game feels like. But don't worry, no matter the time, there's evil amok. And the activities include shootouts, muggings, car chases, burning buildings, bombs, and saving injured civilians. But here's the catch. There is a cutscene before and after every single event. You know how the first game had these events take place dynamically within the world? Not anymore. In some of these, you could spend just as much time in the cutscenes as you do in the crime itself. Does nobody see a problem with this? Do you remember the car takedowns in the first game where in real time the car would be webbed up in the air? Now, Peter pulls the car to a halt and webs it up and we don't even see it happen. Here's the kicker though. I would recommend you don't do these. Not because they're bad, but because the consequences make the game better. This game decided to hop on the trend of implementing a morality meter. In this case, the more crimes you let slip through your fingers, the more your reputation will go down. A big issue with this is that your reputation can go down during story missions, meaning you can stop Electro, a nationwide threat, but your reputation will go down because someone got mugged and you weren't there. Nitpicks aside, as your morality meter goes down, the task force ramps up, introducing checkpoints with enemies across the city, turrets mounted on the side of buildings, and at its peak, spider slayers begin chasing you down, and barriers will appear in mid-air to block you from swinging. This means you have an endless supply of enemies and robots to fight in the open world without loading screens. Swinging has more intensity because you're being shot at all the time, and the barriers mean that swinging has a dynamic challenge as you have to bob and weave between the barriers. I can't believe in a Spider-Man game, they made being seen as a villain more enjoyable than being seen as the hero. In fact, you are punished for being the hero because if you stop any crimes, your reputation goes up. Man, what is happening to me? I feel like this game is fundamentally altering my brain's chemical balance and permanently receding my hairline. I know, I've been really passionate and I can tell because there's already comments from people telling me not to talk so fast, but man, when I first decided to make a video on this game, I thought I was gonna be defending it because at the end of the day, I don't know how, but I like this game. This journey of critically looking at the game has made me realize it got the hate it deserved. When making a sequel, you need to build off the mechanics, story, world, themes of the first game. At the bare minimum, you just need to do the same shit, but again. And somehow, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 has done the same shit, but worse. So many aspects, aside from the swinging, are worse than the first game. I said multiple times that The Amazing Spider-Man was a mediocre game that was carried by its visual flair. So when The Amazing Spider-Man 2, for whatever reason, ditches that flair without improving anything else, we're left with only mediocrity. I can still enjoy this game for what it is, and truthfully, it still has a special place in my heart because for years, this was the only Spider-Man game I had, but I struggle to recommend it. If you love the first game, maybe you'll like this, I'm not sure. But ultimately, I believe this game was the reason Insomniac played their first game so safe. By the time The Amazing Spider-Man 2 came out, we hadn't received a widely praised Spider-Man game since Ultimate. Sure, you could count Web of Shadows, but it didn't review well or sell well. And The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was the final nail in the coffin. They needed a Spider-Man game that ticked all the boxes, and they couldn't afford to take many risks. If the first Amazing Spider-Man game didn't exist, I would be comfortable calling this a good game. But the fact that it does exist, and the fact that it is better in nearly every way, and is running on older hardware, makes this not amazing, but abysmal. Thank you to our patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. And if you want to see these videos early, feel free to join using the link in the description. Thank you for watching, and have a good day. I'm gonna go lie down.